For almost a century, Disney animated films have been considered by most critics to be the pinnacle of the art. Whether you believe that's true or not, one thing we can all agree on is that Disney has had many competitors over the years. The most well-known in households today is the company DreamWorks. Much like Disney, DreamWorks' impressive library of animated films draws heavy inspiration from the myths, legends, fairy tales, and folk stories of the world. One notorious example of this is 2003's Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas. It was a highly ambitious movie, making use of expensive 2D animation augmented by the latest computer-generated effects. It boasted an all-star cast with Brad Pitt as the legendary sailor himself. It was also a disastrous box office bomb, being the movie that, in a string of losses, almost toppled DreamWorks entirely into perpetual bankruptcy, and forced their switch from expensive 2D animation to cheaper 3D animation. It should then beg the question, where did the movie go wrong? First, something you should know before going into this movie with a critical eye is that Sinbad Legend of the Seven Seas is of course based on the Arabic legends of Sinbad, the sailor, not the comedian. The stories of Sinbad and his crew can be seen somewhat as an evolution of the oceanic quests of the older myth of Jason and the Argonauts. Sinbad sails the seven seas of the Middle East and Southeast Asia, encountering exotic lands, dangerous monsters, and experiencing the supernatural events of the world. If you know your history, this shouldn't be so much of a surprise, as Arabic culture played a strong role in preserving the cultural legacy of Greek literature after the Roman Empire's collapse. The story of Sinbad and his 7 voyages is found in the famous 1001 Nights, a compilation of stories from Arabic myth and legend. This compilation features another story you're probably familiar with too, Aladdin. Sinbad and his journeys have been adapted into films in the past, most notably during the explosion of stop motion in the 1950s. However, unlike other classical myths, the stories in 1001 Nights never truly became cultural phenomenon in the Western world. In 1992, Disney had a massive hit with Aladdin, perhaps showing that the world was maybe finally ready for stories from 1001 Nights to make it big in the entertainment industry. Nearly a decade later, Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas came to test the waters. Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas is not a retelling of any of Sinbad's voyages. Instead, it's an amalgamation of many elements from them, put into a new story that borrows many elements of Mediterranean mythology in general. In short, it plays it very fast and loose with its setting and world. In fact, that's probably the best way to describe Sinbad Legend of the Seven Seas. Fast and loose. This is a movie that barrels forth with a lot of enthusiasm, with set piece after set piece, complemented by smooth animation that accents all the action and all the laughs, but at the same time, it can come across as rushed, disconnected, and perhaps maybe too episodic for a movie. Allow me to explain. The story follows the legendary pirate Sinbad looking to make one last big score before he and his crew retire to Fiji. His target is the magical Book of Peace, which keeps the cities across the Mediterranean in harmony. During his attempted boarding of a ship carrying it, Sinbad runs into an old friend, Prince Proteus of Syracuse, charged with transporting the book back to his homeland. Moreover, Sinbad also catches the eye of the goddess of chaos, Eris, who also wants the book. As these two stories entwine, Sinbad is forced into adventure and he must choose where his loyalties lie and discover who he really is as a person. Along the way, Sinbad and his crew encounter fantastic beasts, dangerous monsters, and powerful magic. Naturally, a story like that is a balancing act, having to dedicate a good amount of time to Sinbad's growth as a character while also preparing and presenting its set pieces for maximum pleasure to the audience. Sinbad nails the set pieces, but it's the slower parts of the movie that falter the most, mainly because there aren't all that many and they're rather needed. Granted, there are some pivotal and touching scenes during the beginning and end of the movie between Sinbad and Proteus, as well as Sinbad and Proteus's fiancée, Lady Marina, who accompanies Sinbad on his journey, but by and large, the bulk of the movie is dedicated to action, adventure, and humor. It isn't necessarily a bad thing in and by itself, as the action is great, the adventure is enthralling, and the humor, at least for me, got me chuckling, but the imbalance between the two is easily this movie's greatest flaw. But despite that, I don't think that's the reason it was such a box office bomb. Instead, I think there were larger influences going on at the time that made Sinbad fall short. First, Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas, whilst having more of a generic Mediterranean vibe, is based on a hero from Arabic legend. 2003 was not very far removed from the infamous September 11th terror attacks on the United States in 2001, and tensions were especially high between the Western and Arabic world at the time. As such, much of the Arabic origin of Sinbad was removed for this movie, but the connotation still held. It was in a sense a movie that came out at the wrong time. The other major factor is that animation had already been starting to switch to computer-generated 3D animation since the 1990s at least, with Pixar's Toy Story leading the charge. Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas does feature CGI to complement the 2D animation, but to put it into perspective, the year 2003 also gave us Pixar's Finding Nemo. To the current day audience, Sinbad perhaps was looking dated when compared to its contemporaries. The sad thing is, despite the movie's shortcomings and the shortcomings of its time, the movie isn't really all that bad. It's a solid kids film, and there is just enough there for adults to enjoy, especially if you watch this movie as a kid and want to watch it again as an adult to see what's changed. The performance by the all-star cast is a ton of fun, even if they can be mildly distracting because of how recognizable their voices are. Overall, it is a fun watch if you're in the mood for an animated fantasy adventure. It's almost a shame it has a legacy of disappointment surrounding it, not really derived from where it should be derived, but instead derived by its surroundings. Perhaps one day in the future, the famous pirate will set sail on another potential blockbuster, into the seven seas of entertainment, but until then it looks like he's coming into port, and his latest score isn't worth as much as it should have been.